if we can start recording. Thank you, Maria. And thank you all for joining today's webinar brought to you by the Tribal Law and Policy Institute and the National Criminal Justice Training Center. Today's webinar is titled Juvenile and Young Adults in Corrections and Probation and is presented by Kevin Brennenstuhl, Project Coordinator at the National Criminal Justice Training Center. I will now turn it over to Kevin to introduce himself and to get us started. I also will note that we will hold all questions till the end, but please go ahead and put those in the chat box or in the chat or the Q&A, excuse me. Thank you, Kevin. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here sharing the space with you all for the next hour or so as we go on this journey and we dive into this world of adolescents and young adults. Really excited to be here. Thank you for that short introduction. My name, again, is Kevin Brennenstuhl, Project Coordinator with the National Criminal Justice Training Center. I've been with that agency for about a decade now. Prior to that, I really jumped between several different worlds. I was a victim advocate and victim manager for the Menominee Indian tribe for many years. And after working with victims so long and being in that world, I decided to transition into more of the juvenile corrections and spent a lot of time working juvenile corrections in my home state of Wisconsin, throughout the entire state, actually. And so just been doing a lot of that type of work between victim services and juvenile corrections, and there's a lot of parallels there. And so today we're going to just kind of dive into this world and talk about some of the ramifications with this population, these unique populations. Some of the things that we're going to cover today are just looking at the current status of juveniles and young adults in corrections. We're going to look at kind of just some statistics, kind of paint a picture on a canvas of kind of where that current climate is. We're going to explore some stages of development, looking at youth, and then into some of that adulthood. Again, that population where we're looking at between 18 to 25 even. We're going to talk about communication, but I also spend a little bit of time talking about the R&R principle. So maybe some of you are aware with that. Risk, needs, and responsivity. We're going to spend some time just talking about that. I recognize a few names in the chat or in the participant list. That's great. If you want to be active in chat, I would encourage it. I'm going to ask some chat questions. If you have questions throughout that you would like specifically for me to answer, we're going to try and save those again to the end. So I do appreciate that, but feel free to talk amongst each other if there's a point that's standing out. I definitely encourage that sort of interaction through chat, and I'll do my best to address some of that as well. So let's review right off the bat some statistics for youth and for young adults who are involved in the CJ system. As I mentioned, some of you, I recognize your names. If you've been through our probation academy at NCJTC, you will probably recognize this presentation to some extent. I'm hoping that you get a few new things out of it. I'm hoping that it will allow you to remember some of that, but we're going to look at just some of these numbers right off the bat. For example, 2.1 million youth who are charged with a delinquent act each year in the United States. That's how many? 2.1 million youth. 23%. That's the percentage of all arrests for young adults, 18 to 24. And even though they make up 10% of the population, they're accounting for 23% of the arrests. Now, if we were to actually add juveniles to this, to that young adult population, that percentage actually jumps up to 48%, even though they only make up 32% of the population. So nearly half of all the arrests in the United States are coming from those people under the age of 25, nearly half. Here's a few more numbers. That's the percentage of murders in the United States committed by those under the age of 25. 35%, 23%. That's the percentage of all aggravated assaults committed by those under the age of 25. Some few more numbers. 30%. That's the percentage of all robberies committed by individuals age 25 or under. 28%. That's property crimes, right? 28% of all property crimes are committed by people under the age of 25. And our last one, 36%. That's the percentage of all drug-related crimes for individuals, that magic number of under 25. 166,000 That directly relates to the number of people under the age of 25 who are incarcerated in the United States. That includes prisons, jails, other placements as well. And that number has gone down quite a bit since COVID. So even though it might be a large number, it's actually way lower than it was even, 5 short years ago. 100 to 600. That relates to the facility costs per day on average for someone that's incarcerated. It can range. For juveniles, it might be a lot. We could talk about group homes. We're talking $300 or $400 a daily rate. For those that are incarcerated in state federal systems, we're talking $100 to $200 per day for those that are incarcerated. It's an expensive, very expensive part of this world, this picture that we're painting right now. Just a few last little stats before we talk about some of the meaning behind all this. 3.7 times. So tribal youth are nearly 4 times more likely to be detained or incarcerated compared to their white Caucasian youth. That number is almost 4 times as much. And likewise, 16. That's the estimated percentage of Native American young adults, again, up to that age 24, who are involved in the federal justice system, just the federal justice system. Again, that population accounts for 2.4% of the population. And we're talking 16% who are actually involved in that system. So you're probably saying, all right, Kevin, thanks for really starting off this webinar with this picture. Why are you sharing all this stuff with us? Well, I'm sharing it because these numbers are actually more of a contradiction rather than anything else. It does paint a picture, but I want to fill in the rest of that canvas for you. So over the last quarter century, violent crimes have actually decreased at a pretty steady rate. I believe the rates are somewhere near 40% reductions in violent crime. So I mentioned these statistics on the very beginning, but I also don't want to place this cloud over the heads of our juveniles and our young adults, right? Most crimes that are being committed by juveniles or young adults are not violent. They're not serious, right? They're typically charges for nonviolent property crimes or drug-related crimes. So young adults and juveniles who are incarcerated or placed out of home are usually for, something that's very less serious than what we're thinking of in terms of violence. Overall, and just a word on recidivism rates, overall, the national data has shown that recidivism rates have steadily decreased for nearly all populations. Actually, recently, there's just been some very new data that shows that over the age of 65 is probably the only place where we've seen a slight increase in recidivism. Other than that, all other age groups and populations have decreased. And we know that for the most part, recidivism rates does decrease remarkably as ages increases. So the largest group of people that recidivate, we're usually between the ages of 20 and 24. That's where we're seeing those largest rates. For our juvenile population, 16 and 17-year-olds are most likely to see repeats. If we look at the larger population, again, that population of youth and young adults up to the age of 25, a few other things also kind of are highlighted. We know, for example, that 50% of young adults who recidivate within 3 years of an arrest, they do it within the first year that they're released from an institution. I'll say that again. So if someone, a 21 or 22-year-old or someone, if they get arrested within 3 years, they are actually committing another crime within that first year after they get out of jail or a prison. Even more so, 75% of people under the age of 25 who are released from incarceration, they're going to be rearrested within 3 years. So if we're sending some of these young adults and these juveniles into our prison system or into a correctional facility, 75%, they're getting out within 3 years, they're committing a crime. If we added an extra 2 years and make it kind of a 5-year window, we're actually seeing that number jump up to like 84, 85%. So I know when we talk about recidivism rates that these numbers are incomplete. I wanted to present them here today so that we just have a better understanding of that climate around juveniles and young adults. I know that these numbers are very reliant on how jurisdictions track their own recidivism, how maybe they define that term or maybe the benchmarks that they're using. But nevertheless, I think it's good. I think this picture that we've painted really leads us to make a really strong case to be diligent with a lot of our youthful clients. Um, and there is a case for making that intervention, right? Adolescents who are processed in adult court on felonies are twice as likely to be arrested within 5 years. 80%. That's the percentage of juveniles that were incarcerated that went on to commit crimes as adults. So if we're going to send these juveniles and these young adolescents into adult court or away into some kind of populated um, lockdown facility, we're seeing that we're going to see them back into the system pretty fast, right? Within just a couple of years. 80% that's an eye-opening number for many. What we do know is that for juveniles and youthful clients, we can do a really good job, and we can actually significantly reduce recidivism if we focus on the right things. And that's really what we're going to kind of turn our attention towards today. That's improved assessments, motivation, enhancing that intrinsically, doing some quality case planning, focusing on skill building. Again, we can do that sort of thing with these youthful clients and have impact much more so than our older adults. Again, we're going to explore that point a little bit more. But before we talk about that, I want to throw out our first chat question. What do you feel are the successes and failures of the justice system when working with juveniles and young adults who are convicted of a crime? Feel free to put your answers in the chat. I'm going to do my best to keep coming back to the chat. I know it's going to be more likely that others will be able to read that more so and address that than I would, but I think that's a very important part of us being in this space here is we all get to kind of learn from each other. So what are some of the things that you're seeing, successes and failures with those young adults? While you're writing that, I want to cover this next slide. So maybe some of you have seen this diagram before. If so, you can react to it, use one of those reaction buttons, thumb up in the chat or whatever you'd like. But so this diagram actually lists the common features that successful correction programs have in place or something that they use pretty frequently to reduce recidivism. This diagram comes from the National Institute of Corrections. They conducted this huge study of studies. It's a meta-analysis. I think they had like 500 nationwide studies actually. And what they found was that the most successful programs that worked with young clients and even youthful clients, adult clients, they use these 8 principles to help lower the risk of reoffending. And subsequently, they actually have shown to increase public safety. So these ribbons or steps, however you look at this diagram, as you see them, they're really a blueprint that we can help guide client treatment. That's going to help those clients, those younger adults, work and have actually lasting behavioral change. Actually, they're really important when we're working with youth, incorporating all of these, especially where we know that we have to be engaging, we have to be fair, and we have to supervise these juveniles and young adults kind of at their developmental level. And that's pretty critical. So just looking at the very bottom, we'll go through these pretty quick if you're not familiar with these. The very bottom, that's the foundation of all 8 principles. That's assessing risk and need, where we use a validated or a structured tool to help determine a young adults' risk of reoffending. It also is going to help us look at some of the specific needs that drive that risk. And that could be anything from trauma to their criminal peers, dysfunctional family units, things like that. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it. And these actuarial risk need tools, there's even 4th generation tools now. They really help us figure out what's the likelihood that someone's going to reoffend and what should we be working on. That next ribbon or tier or step is enhancing intrinsic motivation, where we tap into someone's own reasoning for change, making sure that we address things that matter to them, not just things that matter to us, the people that work in this system, right? So we want to use respectful, strength-based language. Maybe you are using some of motivational interviewing. You probably have heard some of that. We want to be using those types of tools just to enhance their own intrinsic. Again, something that comes from their own motivations, right? We want to get them to make those changes on their own. Target interventions is another. That's that R&R principle, where we focus on intensive interventions, again, for our highest risk clients. So those juveniles, those young adults who are the highest risk that on our caseloads, those are the ones we should be focusing on. We should be addressing dynamic or changeable risk factors. We'll talk about that a little bit. We should also be being responsive to their learning styles, their culture, and their readiness to actually make changes with us. So targeting interventions are another one. Skill training and practice, again, teaching real life skills. And we know that our clients, if you're supervising young ones and or if you have those 28 or 21, 22-year olds, we know that sometimes they don't have that emotional regulation. Maybe they're poor communicators. They don't have those problem solving skills figured out yet. Well, that's what we want to do with them. We want to skill train with them and do some actual practice. Again, that's based in this cognitive behavioral world, and there's a lot of role playing stuff that goes into it. But that's what we want to be focusing on with this population. Research also has shown that behavioral change occurs when we actually do a lot of rewards and a lot less punishments. And that gets us to this next one, increasing positive reinforcement. We try and aim for that 4-to-1 ratio where praise is a lot more important than correction. So that's kind of what we're trying to do. If you're giving out 4 praises for every correction with your younger clients, then you're hitting it out of the ballpark. The last one, the last ribbon, I should say, is engaging ongoing support in our natural communities. That's where we build pro-social supports, and that again, that could include families or elders or mentors, employers. Again, these are the types of relationships we want to build because they will sustain change after our involvement with them ends on supervision. You'll see that that ribbon is kind of within a circle, and those last 2 areas are really they're usually forgotten in terms of offender management, but they're very important. So the first one is measured relevant processes. You'll see that, or practices, that's on the right. That's where we track the progress. And we're not just tracking progress on are they compliant with their conditions. Now it's more than that. We should be looking at what they're doing in terms of performance metrics, their quality assurance audits. We want to do fidelity checks to make sure that we're actually seeing changes in them. That's really important. The best programs are doing that sort of work. And then on the other side of that circle is sharing that progress. We want to share these outcomes with the young adults and the youth that we work with, the teams that we work with, any stakeholders, funders, all that. So that feedback loop, it helps us adjust the things that we do, like case planning, or it's going to help us improve the performance and programs and services that we provide. So those are the main parts of the 8 main principles of what we know works when we're talking offender accountability and offender management. And really, it's very important with our youth and young adults. I know I mentioned this a few times already today, but I wanted to come back and talk a little bit more about criminogenic risk. And that really, that refers to the likelihood that a person's going to engage in some sort of future criminal behavior. It's based off of dynamic or changeable factors, but it also includes static factors. You probably know what's static. That's more of those historical things that are hard to change. And again, those are very closely linked. So these risks, they're not, again, about punishment. What they are is they help us understand what drives behavior and kind of where to focus that supervision, where do we focus our treatment, our case planning, things like that. Some of the common risk factors you probably know are substance use, family instability. Maybe you have a young juvenile or adolescent that's struggling in school or being engaged in school. Maybe you have one of those young adults, 21, 22, who just doesn't want to get a job or is unable to. Maybe they're hanging out with criminals or they're hanging out with some antisocial peers. Maybe they have some antisocial attitudes or thinking patterns, right? Maybe they are rationalizing committing crimes. Maybe they're impulsive or they think risky. Maybe they're pleasure seeking. Maybe I just described one of your clients. I don't know. Those are the types of criminogenic risk factors that we're trying to look at and really address. So by identifying these risks through those assessments, those of us who work with young adults, we can target these things, especially where they matter the most. Because in the past, we've always applied that one size fits all approach, and we just know that's not working. That's just not doing it for this population specifically. On this screen, I've included a few tools that collect and help analyze data to help inform your supervision plans with adults and juveniles and adolescents. I'm not here to endorse any of these. I just wanted to let you know that these tools exist and they're there to help your younger clients have a lot better outcomes. So if you're using one of these or if you need one, here's three right off the bat. That link is also for some screener tools that are free, public domain. Um, in addition to those assessments, I include this list of tools that are more focused on juveniles. Again, um, the the other screen are for everyone. These are more focused on younger, up to that age 18. 19 would be the max for most of these. I won't go through them all, but just wanted you to know that they actually exist. And some are self-reporting tools. Some require more training on how you facilitate them or conduct them. Not all these tools on your screen are that you're seeing are free, just so you know that, but there's a lot out there. So if you're looking to bring assessments into your work, then I would start at some of these probably. Okay, so we've covered a lot of that very beginner evidence-based practice work. I want you to think of something that maybe you engaged in when you were 16 or even 18, that would just make you mad today if someone did it, right? So maybe you have your own young adult living with you. I have 17-year-old twins, and I'll tell you what, my reaction, I don't even tell you my reaction if I found out that they were doing some of the things I did when I was their age. Right? If you're comfortable, if you want to put some of that in chat, go right ahead. Maybe I'll even ask it a different way. What type of behavior do we generally expect for our young adults and our older adolescents? You can throw that into chat if you'd like. So when I was young, I've spent half of my adult working life working with juveniles who've been in prison and correctional facilities. And I find it, I don't know if it's ironic or what the word is, but it's surprising how easily I could have been in their shoes instead of being on the other side of that that room or that cell, right? When I was young, being young and foolish, I had a slingshot like you see on the screen, and I had a couple buddies my age. And if you know how winters are in Wisconsin, if you make a snowball at 7 in the morning before you go to school and you come back after going to school, that ball is not soft anymore. It's like an ice ball. Well, there's an opportunity to launch ice balls onto, fast moving cars where I lived. And so if there's a car on the highway literally 100 feet away going 65 miles an hour, what do you think a 16 and a 17-year-old would do if you had ice balls and a slingshot? Make some very, very silly mistakes, silly decisions, right? Um, and I think that's I'm luckily nothing happened. I can't even imagine the outcomes of where I would be in my life had I actually hit one of those vehicles with an ice ball. Um, or forbid what actually would have happened, to someone had I succeeded with that. The main point I'm trying to get at with that is as adults, we get that picture of long-term consequences because our brains actually have really matured enough to understand that if A happens, then B is likely to follow as a result. Youth and younger adults, they don't act in isolation. Their behavior is shaped by a lot of different layers of influence. There's this ecological model, the ecological systems theory, actually. It reminds us to look beyond those individuals and consider their environment. That includes taking a good look at like their personality traits, their identity, looking at their schools, their families, their neighborhoods, even social media, things again. Looking at all these things, at all these different layers of things that really make up, who our youth and our younger adults are. We have this opportunity, I think, then to meet youth and young adults at their developmental level. we can really have an impact in their life. We can meet them where they're at. I think we say that a lot in this line of work. It's not just rehabilitation though. It's actually habitation in their own lives, where I think some of those younger adults and adolescents can actually show some resiliency. So for our younger clients, the interventions that we provide may actually be only one of the only shots they get to help, change their life around or help them out long term. It's kind of cliche to say that, but I truly believe that, knowing that if we're really working with them, um, at their developmental level, that's probably one of the most important things that we can do. So when we begin talking about interventions and we start looking at interventions with these young adults, there's really two critical areas that determine success. And the first is that emotional and cognitive development. And I always try and associate that with like brain. Think brain. So if we talk emotional and cognitive development, think brain. And then the second area is are those ecological players, those pro-social or positive people that are in their lives. So we're going to take a quick look at brain development, and then we'll move over to those ecological players. So brain science shows that our brains, especially those prefrontal cortex areas that are responsible for like impulse control and judgment, understanding that if A then B mentality, that's not really developed until our mid 20s, 25, 26. And this is critical when we're working with young adults, especially those between 18 and 25, because they are legal adults, but developmentally, they're still maturing. So young adults are more likely to, you know, act out on emotion. There's a lot more peer pressure at that age. They're less able to foresee those long-term consequences. We know for a fact that they like rewards more so than punishments. Um, but yet they're still capable of significant change with the right support. So, by considering brain development in our responses, we have to avoid treating young adults like those fully formed adults on our caseload. Instead, we should be providing responses that are age appropriate, that are restorative. Again, they should be rooted in science somehow, some of this science that's coming out on this. This supports a lot better outcomes. And again, it reduces that likelihood of the younger adults reoffending. I think we need to actually consider a lot of new intervention models for our young adults. And we should be borrowing from all this research that we're learning about brain development. Legally, young adults may be treated as adults in the criminal legal system, but our assessment, our interventions, they need to look a lot different and really adapt to what we know about what their development areas are, right? And I'll address one other thing. So, legal culpability. That refers to the degree that someone's formally responsible or someone's blameworthy under the law, right? So, this is, again, typically based on age and whether the person understood that their actions were wrong or unlawful. So, when we get this by the time we get to 18, most people are considered legally culpable and treated as adults and they go to adult court. But there's this whole other side, this moral culpability, and that's very different. It asks things like, to what extent is this person, truly is this person really blameworthy? Again, based on their developmental capacity to make logical and sound judgments. And we can see from all this research, those young adults all the way up to age 25, they're still developing in those key areas that govern impulse control, the emotions, emotional regulation, um, long-term thinking. This means that, they probably do know right from wrong, which is the legal standard for culpability, but they probably also lack that full capacity to consistently act on that understanding, or they don't have that moral culpability, if that's making sense. I know courts, the juvenile courts have been doing a lot of this. Tribal courts, I've heard a lot of great things out in the field about this. We're seeing that there's an increased that these courts are increasingly considering all these developmental factors when they're determining how to hand out sentences or even just respond to different offenses, right? That includes looking at things like trauma histories, maturity levels. again, looking at all this stuff when recognizing that that moral culpability, it may be lower even when that legal responsibility still does exist. So, um, yeah, there's just a lot there connecting, 24, 25-year olds with those 17 and 18-year olds than we ever thought of. We're gonna just dive a little bit deeper, one step further. Hang with me. So my intent is not to dust off those psychology books. I do want to mention a couple of theorists who looked at that emotional and cognitive development. So just bear with me, all. I know we're going to dive one step deeper. So some of you probably are familiar with Erik Erikson and Jean Piaget, and how both their ideas relate, well, um, they relate to development and how we interact with juveniles and young adults in the correctional field. So Erikson believed that people move through key psychosocial challenges at different areas or stages of their life. For a lot of the young adults, um, there's these there's a couple different stages that are really important. So for those that are under the age of 18, they start exploring their identity, they start developing values, they're trying to figure out how they fit in, right? For those that are a little bit older, those 18, 19, 22-year olds, we start seeing that they're forming, how do they form relationships? How do we make larger life choices? And that was really that work of Erickson and kind of looking at those different stages. For our justice involved clients, what we know is that a lot of times they're getting stuck between these stages, right? And especially if trauma or instability disrupts that development. So whereas people just could transition from those stages, we're seeing a lot of our clients that are justice involved kind of stuck in limbo in this area between stages. In a similar way, Jean Piaget, he focused on how thinking and reasoning kind of changes over time. So by late adolescence and by young adulthood, most people get to this area where, or this stage where they start thinking abstractly, where they can understand others' perspective. However, again, we know that not all young adults are reaching the stage at the same time or on time, right? If you have some trauma or you have developmental delays, maybe you've had some hard times with school or family or neighborhoods, that's gonna, you know, maybe change that timeline. And so the work of Piaget and Erikson, some extent, Lawrence Kohlberg, helps us to better understand that emotional and cognitive and some level even social development is not as set in stone as we think it is. I think it's maybe also it helps us to avoid overestimating a young person's reasoning ability just because they look grown up, if that makes sense. Maybe that's a good way to put that. So I think it's important we just have to know that there's a long history of this research out there, and we're seeing where these areas exist between that research that, some of our 22-year-olds just maybe aren't there yet. If you get nothing else from this whole presentation, take away this slide. These are the three questions that really reflect the core developmental needs of adolescents and emerging adults. So whether they say it out loud or not, our clients, our justice involved youth or young adults are constantly asking themselves, am I normal? Am I competent? And am I lovable? So when they're saying, am I normal? They're asking themselves, do I fit in? Is what I'm feeling, is that okay? What am I doing? Is it okay to do what I want to do? So these younger adults, they're trying to understand where they belong socially, culturally, emotionally. And again, this includes a lot of understanding of their identity, their peer acceptance, and feeling seen on some level. That's all under am I normal, right? Am I competent? You'll hear them saying, can I do this? Do I have, skills? Do I have value as a person? A lot of our younger adults and juveniles in the system, they feel like failures. That could be failing in academics, maybe socially they're failures, behaviorally they're with us, so they think maybe they're failures. But they need opportunities to succeed as well, not just be corrected, but to build some self-efficacy. So um, they're asking themselves, am I competent? And then am I lovable? Know that your clients are asking themselves, like, you know, am I worthy of being, connecting with people? What would happen if I disappeared? Would anybody even care? A lot of justice involved youth carry trauma and abandonment and rejection and all that stuff. And their behavior often kind of covers up these deeper questions of whether they're worthy of affection or even connection on some level. So these aren't just soft questions, they really do directly impact motivation, risk-taking behaviors. They directly impact how people form their identities, the way youth and younger adults respond to authority. Um, if their environments, and that includes like reentry programs, their probation, case managers, if we can answer yes to these questions through consistency by showing them support and respect, then our young adults are far more likely to change and engage with us. So, wanted just to mention this slide. This is one of the most impactful things that I've learned working with juveniles and young adults. If I always have this, like these three questions next to my computer when I was in the field, I always wanted to make sure that I was coming back to these three questions because it's what's on the mind of your clients. So that's a lot of the emotional cognitive development. And we talked a little bit about ecological players. And that's that second area that's really crucial for the success. Um, when we talk about ecological players, we're referring to the key people or the systems, those environments that influence young person's development and identity to some extent. So these players, they surround the youth and they can either increase risk, where they serve as like protective supports, or um, they could be peers, they could be teachers, counselors, therapists, elders, coaches, parents, of course. So the biggest point, I guess, with ecological players is that when we engage with those people, whether that's again in reentry or probation, um, when we are engaged with their support systems, we're strengthening that young client's chances to be successful. One of the biggest and most important ecological players in addressing the needs of juveniles and even young adults is their immediate family. And that obviously can include biological parents, foster parents, legal guardians, grandparents, even extended family, role models. Again, it can depend on the situation, but when these types of support systems are active, then we know that the risk of recidivism drops exponentially. And the importance of family really begins with education on what to expect. So oftentimes, and I found our families, or in many cases, single parents, they don't know what to expect from the justice system. As someone who works with young adults who actually still probably live at the home, you need to get families to cooperate with you rather than be that barrier against you. How do you get them on your side? Well, I would say it starts by educating them about what's going to happen and let them be active in some form of supervision. And I don't mean just pandering to them, I'm saying as active as they can be. Explain as much as you can about the process that you're going to be using. Maybe you invite them to check ins. Maybe they have a little say in case planning. I guarantee you they're the best source of information for protective factors if you're making a list on that. So essentially, you want to equip families with skills that they can reinforce those behavioral changes that you're talking about. And they can do that in that home setting. If you have an older client that's still living and residing in a home, that's frequent, right? Just because the 19-year-olds are past 18 doesn't mean we're always kicking them out of the house, right? Perhaps, including even for 18, 19, 20-year-olds, maybe include them in some kind of family therapy, multi-systemic therapy, or I think, what's the other one? FFT is another great one, functional family therapy. Try to use families as a support rather than a hurdle as much as you can with those younger adults. Before we move on to communication, I want to just briefly talk about diversionary programming. And I've worked in juvenile prisons. I've worked at youthful offender correctional facilities for like 20, 21, 22-year-olds. I've worked in I've been in charge of a residential treatment facility for adolescents, again, 15 to 17-year-olds. I think, at this residential facility, I met a lot of kids, a lot of younger adults. One that stood out for me, I still remember to this day, his name's Carl. Carl was a great kid. Carl was great at school. He was great at interacting with people. He was a great rule follower. He didn't act impulsively. He wasn't a risky thinker much. We basically called Carl. Carl was a good kid with a weed problem, right? Carl was in a lockdown type 2 facility, basically one step out of a juvenile prison, because he had some addiction issues with marijuana. That was it. I mean, he didn't have a lot of other areas where we saw a lot of needs, and yet we were putting him in with people that had committed juveniles and young adults that had committed murders, sexual assaults, a lot of more violent crimes and higher risk cases. And so for Carl, we had him in this area and it wasn't a great situation. For Carl, he needed to be involved in a diversion program rather than some kind of high risk residential facility. And there's some really great programs that would be better suited for people like Carl. Um, we had community based diversionary programs like teen courts. I know there's restorative justice circles, there's mediation, there's community service groups for some of the younger populations. I know there's like adolescent drug courts. Um, Again, those might be better options for your community. And I know TLPI would probably have a long list of them. I know we do as well. So if you're looking for some cool ideas around diversionary programs, don't hesitate to ask us for that in chat. But if you have a high rate of juvenile or young offenders on your caseload, you might want to start thinking and planning around diversionary steps. They're, again, designed for lower risk clients, something typically like 3 to 6 months total. And also know that you're going to have the benefit of not having all those young adults on your active caseload. And we all know that, how big caseloads can get at the time we need. So if we can shrink those caseloads even more, even better, right? Okay. I'm just checking chat real quick. I'm seeing some great stuff in chat. Y'all are some great stuff there. I love the interaction that's happening there. So keep that up. We're going to move into our next area, which is communication. It's a really important part of all this that's related to juveniles and young adults. So effective communication and those MI skills, member motivational interviewing skills that you learned, or maybe have learned, there's going to be one of the greatest things you have in your toolkit, right? Especially when we're trying to manage and improve outcomes for our clients. So I had a pretty great and wise supervisor when I first got into the field, and she always used to say, the right kid with the right intervention at the right time. And those three components are really the building blocks to supervising younger adults and younger clients. And the best way to hit that trifecta there is through interactions that we have with kids. It's probably fair to say that we all understand the different types of communication that we have with people. So we have verbal communication, that's what we say and how we actively listen. And then we have nonverbal communication. That's what we observe. That's how our bodies react to messaging, things like that. We also have communication through written mediums, right? That can be a whole bunch of different stuff, like on paper, on social media posts, anything where things are written, really. Well, these types are all important. All of them are really important when we're talking about communication with younger clients. But it's not just what we say or write, it's also the manner in which things are communicated. So I want to show you this video and let you hear some of the things that are still occurring with some of our younger adults.
It starts with a bang. Organized chaos ensues. Follow instructions or
Down! Up! Down! Up!
We follow a military model.
It's a challenge.
We demand and will instill respect.
We're not gonna take you out on a date. I don't care if you think we're cute.
This summer camp is not meant to be fun.
I feel like you're in trouble a little bit.
Everything you say, yes sir, no sir, do you understand?
It's a wake-up call.
They've never been asked to be accountable for their actions. They made the decision that got them here.
Got into a fight? What's your malfunction?
Drugs, sir.
Did you just say, drugs, sir? You were defiant with the police, weren't you?
That kind of bad behavior stops here.
Yes, sir! I don't care how you act back on the block or at home. You will not act that way here at camp. Do you understand? Yes, sir!
For some parents, the no-nonsense camp is a last resort,
Bet you wish you weren't ding-dong ditching now, huh?
a way to keep their child out of juvenile court.
She's got to do this camp to keep from having it on her record.
What are you looking around for?
For others, it's a choice they make,
What's the best?
a glimmer of hope when all else has failed.
Maybe you ought to take a little initiative next time.
I'm hoping it'll change his whole attitude because his grades are suffering in school. His behavior at home is getting worse.
Let's go! I need some more people!
For these teens, mind, body, and soul are tested
Like I said, you're in for the challenge of your life.
as they learn respect, how to make better decisions, and undergo a serious attitude adjustment.
We want these students to be leaders. Right now, unfortunately, they're leaders in the wrong direction.
So yeah, that was something. Hey, yeah, so boot camps do exist, and I don't every time I watch that video, I'm just like, man, the yelling and for some even simple things like that. I know I still think that there's TV shows on there glamorizing this practice, right? I think there always used to be like scared straight things on TV. I think there's still some of that where basically you just yell for an hour at juveniles and adolescents. But I played it because there's a way that we should be talking with, younger kids. Some of them were pretty young in this video, but even 19, 20-year-olds, knowing where they're at, their developmental and social developmental levels. This boot camps are very outdated yet, and they've been shown to actually not reduce recidivism. They don't change behaviors. You're just yelling at kids and normalizing that screaming experience. What we do know that's worked, a few of the things that you're seeing on your screen, right? Open your ears, be a listener, don't be a talker as much. Keep your mouth shut as much as you can. When appropriate, provide eye contact. I know that's not always appropriate, but in certain circumstances, it probably is. So use eye contact. When I was working with kids, I used sarcasm and humor quite a bit. I also knew that it was never intended to be against or for an individual, because I always wanted to make sure respect was given, because that's what was kind of demanded, right? Respect gets respect. So while I used humor, it was never directed at anyone in an insulting way. Once you get kids talking, trust me, it's hard to get them talking. It's hard to get my own kids in my own house talking, right? I know, but once you do, let them go. Just let them lead the way, because they will take you to some really cool places. The biggest takeaway for communication with this population is being responsive to their needs and understanding that there's, again, not that one size fits all approach. I think in appropriate terms, I would bet that most of you probably know what these abbreviations stand for. Again, these are codes that are often used by youth, young adults, the hipsters, as they say, to communicate pretty quickly, maybe sometimes discreetly, sometimes playfully. BRB, OMG, WTF, we probably LOL, we probably know what some of these are, right? If not all of them. In the juvenile justice context, recognizing, some of these terms is going to help you better understand the written communication that your clients are using. So again, if you need any types of resources around appropriate terms, let TLPI know. I think we'll have some great resources to help you out. If you know the first ones, maybe you don't know these as well. Again, some of these are a little old. 182 is I hate you. 53X is sex. Parents are watching, sealed with the kids, parents over the shoulder. Yeah, some of these are older again. Of course, emojis and GIFs, GIFs or whatever they're called are the new thing. I'm not going to necessarily identify all the ones you're seeing on your screen, but just know that they're not necessarily appropriate. So if you're looking for more information, again, about these slang terms, how you can more effectively communicate with a younger population, you can always Google things. Google's a friend. You can ask if you have kids. Um, Similar to me, you have kids that maybe know that. Maybe they'll tell you. I learned all about mid and getting mossed and bet and all this stuff. You learn all that language, right? If those aren't options for you, again, let us know, reach out to us. We'll try and provide you with some cool websites or resources that you can learn more about all this. You should really be knowing the lingo and appropriate terms that are being used. Trust me, it's really cool to communicate, even on you might even think that you're doing it kind of in a joking way. But if you start using some of their terms, you get a little bit more respect, and that just goes a long way to helping work with clients, right? If you're looking for more technique-based assistance on how to speak with these younger clients, you might want to focus on these 4 principles. And if you are familiar with MI, you've probably seen these before. Express empathy. We often confuse empathy with sympathy, I think. Well, some of us do. Sympathy is feeling sorry for someone. That's not what empathy is. What that means is that we're simply trying to understand one of your client's situation from their perspective, being an active listener, reflecting back to the youth about their feelings or their thoughts or any cool experiences they're telling you about. Again, doing that without judgment. That's the main practice that we want to push through. So seeing their situation from their point of view is going to help you as a professional figure out ways to let them, get more long-term sustainable changes um, to change the bad behaviors that we're seeing. Rolling with resistance. So if you confront someone about using drugs or alcohol, and you just say, "Hey, you need to stop using that," what are they going to say? They're going to resist you probably. You're gonna hear some really funny and unique things, right? At least initially, they're going to come across and probably say, "It's not a problem. It's no big deal." You know, rather than pushing back with your younger clients, you know, try and stay away from those confrontational exchanges. You should just roll with that resistance by remembering and reminding your client that ultimately it's really their choice whether they want to, get through this and be compliant and do your thing with probation. So your role again is to react to their situations based on the choices that they make. Don't argue with them about their choice, just roll with it. Again, that's really helpful when we're trying to reduce power struggles and it kind of invites the younger people to stay more engaged in conversations if we're not trying to always push back at them. So developing discrepancy is a really cool tool. I love using this, especially with these younger populations. So discrepancy that exists where there's a difference between your client's values and their beliefs and what they're actually showing you through their behavior. So it's cool because you get to help you see there's a gap between where they are and where they want to be. And again, you don't even have to tell them what to do, or help them explore this mismatch where their current behavior and their future goals kind of, maybe that's a better way to say that. There's this gap or mismatch between future goals and their current behavior. An example would be, you said that your goal is to graduate and skipping school is making that real hard. How do you kind of fit that stuff together? Knowing that you want to graduate, but skipping school is hard. How do you fit that together? So the point is not to blame them. It's again, change for them it's up to them to do that. And they have to recognize that their own choices conflict with their own goals. Using that technique with younger adults, those 18, 19-year-olds is very helpful. The last principle that I want to just address before we move into case planning is self-efficacy. I mentioned this earlier, and that refers to someone's ability to produce some kind of result, a desired result. So in probation, we do a lot of stuff historically where it's like we're going to be quick to point out some of the things you're lacking or things you need to change. But a lot of times we never focus on those positive things. So instead, we want to encourage the belief that change is actually possible. I think we say it in the field all the time. Catch them doing something right. That's what we want to focus on. So if we're very supportive in this regard, then a lot of the young adults on our caseload are, again, more likely to take those positive steps. Again, if you're looking for more resources related to MI or around these MI concepts, feel free to reach out directly to me and we can talk more. I think at the end of these slides, my contact information will be up. Would love to talk to you more about MI, motivational interviewing. So just a few more things as we kind of wrap up our time together, this journey we're on. If you're currently working with young adults, then you're probably aware that case planning and case management are very different, but yet equally important functions. So when we're looking at rules, conditions, sorry about that, rules, conditions, doing some kind of monitoring, it's really important, but the real bang for our buck comes in this area called case planning. And that should really guide our journey towards change with our young adults and our youth and juveniles. It shouldn't be used as a tool to measure how many times they screwed up. It should be more like, I think we called it like a roadmap. Yeah, I think I wrote that roadmap mentality, right? Where we should focus on where we want to be headed with our young adults, not where we've been. So planning with them is going to help identify obstacles, detours along the way. It's going to help. It should be built with them instead of for them. So when we're creating case plans, always with them. Again, case plans are cool because they can be adjusted over time. It shouldn't just empower. A case plan should be used, I guess, to empower youth to take ownership of their own change practice, not just track every infraction that they have, and they're probably going to have a lot. So just a quick little idea on case planning. We know that young adults are more likely to engage and follow through with case planning if they are able to help shape their own, like we said. So ask a lot of questions. We want to invite their input, do a lot of co-creation with their goals. Again, this builds ownership and trust, and they should be real life. Make sure that your case plans are identifying those personal triggers, those risky situations that they're gonna find themselves in when they're not in your office or with you. Any specific needs. We don't want it to be abstract. We want it to be concrete, achievable, right? So, definitely encourage your young adult clients to use I statements. Again, that's going to promote accountability and probably do some stuff with their own intrinsic motivation. Maybe I get angry when this happens, or I want to stay out of trouble because I need to pay down my debt to my father, or whatever that looks like with your clients, right? And incentives, that's the final point here. Incentives work. I'm telling you, even with the most stubborn of people, they work for me, and I'm very stubborn, right? We know. So yes, use incentives, and use them creatively. Positive reinforcement, like things like praise, giving them extra privileges, recognitions. That's going to help keep youth motivated a lot more than than the other options that we're just not recognizing that sort of thing. If you have to use sanctions as part of your supervision strategies, just make sure that they're not arbitrary, they're direct, and they're not overly punitive, right? So they're a young adult or a juvenile, they're going to make mistakes. That's just how it's going to happen. But the consequence should be fair. It should be restorative on many levels. It should not be a checkbox, right? It's not just like, all right, you did this, now you have to do this. You should be more unique and meaningful to them. So maybe you have someone who had some vandalism as part of their charge, right? Well, maybe doing some community service tied to repairing the harm that they created for the community. Focusing on that. Maybe it's writing an apology letter to someone to acknowledge that they had some pretty bad impact on other people. Things like that give more opportunities for them to grow and take accountability rather than just being punitive. Our last chat question for the day as we start wrapping up here. I know we're about time. If you want to start throwing some stuff into chat about this, I have two final slides on responsivity here, and then I'll open it up to questions. But for here, if you want to start putting into chat some of the supervision strategies you have for juveniles and how does that differ from some of those adults? You can throw those in the chats. It's always good to hear what others are thinking about that situation. But for me, that was this final point is involving supervising clients again under the age of 25. It's about focusing and honoring them individually, and that's done through responsivity. That's how we treat them. It's how we match services to their abilities. And strength-based practice and responsivity, they go hand in hand, right? So while responsivity focuses on matching the right services to our youth or our young adults, that includes like their learning style, their culture, their readiness to change, things like that. The strength-based supervision ensures that we build from what's working. Just, not just correct what's wrong with people, but instead of asking like, what's the problem with this young guy, or why is my 18-year-old, always messing up with this? What's going on there? Instead of asking those types of things, maybe we should ask like, what strengths can we activate to help support some actual change for this kid, right? So by honoring juveniles or honoring our young adults and respecting their identities and interests and cultural backgrounds and adapting our approach, we can really increase engagement and promote some long-term outcomes. That could be using art or mentoring. It could be strength-based, support, however that looks. Maybe there's some cultural-based mentoring. I'm not sure, but in your community, you want to find some of those areas, that really support increased engagement. That sounds very textbook-ish, like you read that right out of a textbook, but it doesn't have to be. It can be something very simple, right? Like uh, maybe it means just having a young adult go and work with an elder or a mentor in some kind of cultural program, rather than just shipping him off to some room to do anger management class. It's something as simple. It could be something as simple as changing the clock, literally changing the type of clock that someone uses. When I was working at the residential facility, we had a teenager, again, really good kid. Very few problems with him, but this kid was always late to every meal. He was late to every school function. Every time we had programming within this building, he was late to it. And it's like, dude, what's going on with you? Why are you always late? Like, we don't have issues. We never yell. There's never, great kid, just you're always late. Well, it turns out he didn't know like what time to come out of his room. Like we knew that he had to stay in his room until staff told him to come out, but we would just be like, come out of your room at certain time for, school or for lunch or for meds or whatever that looks like. And he never came. He didn't know how to read the actual digital or um, the actual clock on his wall. It was a clock that had the hour and minutes hands and second hands on, and he didn't know how to read that. He grew up looking at a digital clock that had numbers on it. Something as simple as changing out a clock is, how we look at kind of that responsivity, right? Something very simple. Yes, it can involve a lot of big stuff in terms of treatment and matching, personalities and learning, but it can be something as simple as that. So that main point is that we need to be mindful of being strength-based with our clients and ensure that the right fit for them and the services that we offer and the things that we're doing for them. So like Drake said, we started from the bottom and now we're here. And so I hope that, this presentation was very helpful. I provided you with some cool tools, some new techniques, ideas that you have as you kind of keep working with this really developing population of juveniles and young adults. Again, if we have time for questions, I will plan to stick around. I know we're up against our hour here. I'll do my best to answer all your questions. Thank you so much. If you'd like to reach out to me more about probation or ideas of reentry or motivational interviewing or anything else in this presentation, I'll throw my contact information up here on this slide. I'll leave it up here for a little bit, and then I'll turn it back over to our moderators. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. I am actually not seeing any questions in the chat. So if anybody does think of any questions that you may have, you can always reach out to us and you can send those to Kevin or you can send those to us here at TLPI and we'll make sure to answer them for you and get the answer back to you as soon as possible. So Kevin, if you can advance to the next slide, if you all could take a few minutes to do the evaluation, we would definitely appreciate that as well. And we'll leave that up for a couple of minutes. We also will drop that in the chat as well. So again, I just want to say thank you for attending today's webinar, Juvenile and Young Adults in Corrections and Probation. And again, thank you to Kevin for joining us today and presenting the material. The webinar recording will be posted on walkingoncommonground.org. That will also be sent out to our mailing list as well. And then I also want to share that this webinar is a part of a series of monthly webinars developed to support the development and enhancement of tribal courts, tribal justice systems, and intergovernmental collaborations. The webinars are brought to you by the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, the National American Indian Court Judges Association, and the Tribal Judicial Institute UND School of Law. And our next webinar is scheduled to be on August 6th, and it's titled Problem Solving Skills for Tribal Court Personnel. And we will have the registration link available in the chat. That will also be shared by email to all attendees along with today's webinar recording and materials. And again, the link is in the chat and on the screen for you to fill out the evaluation. And again, if you have any questions, please let us know.